What if the conspiracy theories weren't theories at all? What if the darkest rumors in American history, the coups, the cover-ups, the poisoned towns, the presidential lies, turned out to be true? These aren't urban legends. They're documented, verified, forgotten, on purpose. 49 myths you were told to laugh off, explained in black and white, buried in footnotes, and now clawing their way back into the light. This isn't history class. This is the fine print they hoped you'd never read. Welcome to 49 American history myths that turned out to be true. 1. The U.S. overthrew democratically elected governments. It's not paranoia if they really did it. In the dusty archives of Cold War justification, neatly labeled Freedom, you'll find a folder, thick, redacted, and quietly damning, detailing the American art of toppling democracies. For decades, these accusations were dismissed as Soviet propaganda, the fever dreams of fringe thinkers. But then came the documents. Declassified, dry, unapologetic. And suddenly, the line between myth and national policy blurred. Guatemala, 1954. Jacobo Arbenz, a democratically elected leader, made the fatal mistake of trying to redistribute land, including swaths held idle by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with friends in very high places. Arbenz wasn't a communist, but he didn't need to be. The CIA labeled him Redlining, and that was enough. Operation PBE Success was born. It involved psychological warfare, an army of mercenaries, and a carefully engineered perception of chaos. Arbenz resigned under pressure, replaced by a military regime. Thousands died in the decades of civil war that followed. But the bananas were safe. Iran, 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the country's oil, a bold move that irritated the British and flustered the Americans. Once again, democracy was inconvenient. The CIA's Operation Ajax sowed dissent, paid off mobs, and propped up the Shah, whose secret police would later become a byword for torture. Western oil flowed once more, until it didn't. The 1979 revolution didn't come from nowhere. It came from history left to rot in silence. Chile, 1973. Salvador Allende, a Marxist but democratically elected, walked a line Washington found intolerable. The Nixon administration, with Kissinger's fingerprints all over it, pushed an economic stranglehold, then backed a military coup. Tanks rolled into Santiago. Allende died, officially by suicide, though suspicions remain, and General Pinochet took power. He ruled with torture and terror for 17 years. A U.S. official later remarked, "We helped create the conditions." That's putting it lightly. For a country that claims to export democracy, the U.S. has often delivered the opposite, quietly, forcefully, and with plausible deniability. It wasn't about ideology, not really. It was about control, resources, optics, and sometimes about preventing a good example. But we're not done. Because if you thought regime change was reserved for other countries, wait until you hear what happened inside the U.S. border. Cointelpro was real. Disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize. That's not from a Bond villain. That's an FBI memo, signed off by J. Edgar Hoover himself. The counterintelligence program, Cointelpro, wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a government operation that ran for 15 years, targeting civil rights leaders, leftist organizers, and anyone deemed a threat to the status quo. Their crime? Wanting justice. Martin Luther King Jr. got a letter from the FBI urging him to kill himself. That's not speculation. It's in the archives. Typewritten, clinical, and laced with menace. You know what you are, it says. There is only one thing left for you to do. That letter was sent just before King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. The Black Panthers were labeled the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, not because they were arming for revolution, but because they were feeding children, running free health clinics, and demanding dignity. So the FBI infiltrated them, turned them against one another. And in the case of Fred Hampton, helped orchestrate a pre-dawn raid that ended with a bullet to the head. He was 21. Even mainstream groups weren't safe. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, anti-war protesters, Puerto Rican independence activists, the American Indian movement, all infiltrated, all surveilled, all placed on lists. It wasn't about law and order. It was about power, about shaping the narrative, making sure no movement could gather enough momentum to shift the ground beneath the powerful. The program officially ended in 1971. Unofficially? Who knows? The tactics never quite vanished. They just got rebranded. National security, counterterrorism, threat assessment. The language changes. The methods echo. And if the FBI spent decades undermining American citizens with illegal surveillance, psychological manipulation, and targeted violence, what would happen if you gave even more power to even less accountability? It's a good question, especially when the answer involves LSD, memory erasure, and the CIA playing mad scientist. 3. MK Ultra happened. If you pitched it as a Netflix series, they'd say it's too far-fetched. A secret program, funded by taxpayers, run by the CIA. The goal? Mind control. The method? LSD. Hypnosis, electroshock, torture. The victims? Unwitting civilians, soldiers, prisoners, even hospital patients. Welcome to MK Ultra, the government's decades-long experiment in psychological manipulation that sounds like science fiction, because it basically was. In the 1950s, paranoia wasn't just in the air, it was budgeted for. The Cold War had created an arms race for the human mind. If the Soviets could brainwash prisoners, then by God, America would brainwash harder. Enter Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a fondness for untraceable poisons and a title that sounded harmless. Head of the CIA's Technical Services Division. He was the architect of the program, and his methods were imaginative. People were dosed with LSD without consent. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll lured men to safe houses, where they were drugged and observed behind two-way mirrors. Mental hospital patients were pumped full of psychedelics for weeks on end, told it was therapy. In Canada, Dr. Ewan Cameron, paid with CIA funds, erased people's memories using drug-induced comas and repetition tapes. Some never came back. All of this happened. The receipts are real. The records, at least the ones that weren't destroyed in a panic before the Senate hearings, confirm it. MK Ultra ran from the early 1950s until 1973, when it was quietly shut down after it became a liability. No one was prosecuted, no apology was issued, and many of the victims never even knew they were part of it. The irony? It didn't work. The CIA never found the key to mind control. But in trying, they proved something far more chilling, that they were willing to destroy lives in pursuit of control, that the ends justified any means, and that the American government, when it thought no one was looking, acted like the very dystopias it claimed to fight. And if MK Ultra was happening in hospitals, labs, and safe houses, what was happening in public health clinics? What if the experiments weren't secret at all, just hidden in plain sight? 4. Tuskegee experiment was real. They told the men they had bad blood. They didn't explain what that meant. They didn't say they had syphilis. They didn't mention there was already a cure. Instead, they gave them placebos, vitamins, spinal taps disguised as treatment, and a pat on the back for doing their part for science. The men were poor, black, and from Macon County, Alabama. And for 40 years, the U.S. government watched them suffer. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932, sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service. The plan was simple. Observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. No treatment, just tracking. It was supposed to last 6 months. It lasted 4 decades. And it only stopped when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press in 1972. That's not a typo. 1972. By then, At least 128 participants had died from the disease or its complications. Dozens of wives were infected. Some of their children were born with congenital syphilis. But the study marched on because the government had a theory that black bodies responded to disease differently and that their suffering could be useful. The myth, for years, was that this was an exaggeration, that it couldn't have gone on that long without someone noticing, that it couldn't have been this blatant. And yet, it was all in writing. Consent forms, internal memos, clinical notes. They called it a study in nature, as if the men were wild specimens, not human beings. No one faced criminal charges. No agency was dissolved. A formal apology came from President Clinton in 1997. 25 years after the study ended, and long after most of the participants had passed. By then, Tuskegee had become a byword for medical betrayal and a slow-burning justification for generations of mistrust in American healthcare. But the uncomfortable truth is this: Tuskegee wasn't a deviation from the system. It was the system. Deception, control, exploitation, dressed up in lab coats and paperwork. And if this happened under the banner of public health, with doctors and federal funding, what else have we been told was necessary for security that turned out to be something else entirely? 5. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was exaggerated. It started with radar blips and static on a dark sea. In August 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. On August 2nd, it engaged with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. That happened. Shots were fired. It was tense, ambiguous, but real. Then came August 4th. The Maddox reported another attack. Radar pings, radio chatter, a torpedo sighting, or maybe it was just waves. The crew wasn't even sure what had happened. Neither was the NSA. But Washington didn't wait for clarity. President Lyndon B. Johnson took to the airwaves and declared that the United States had been attacked again, unprovoked, aggressively, and unmistakably. Congress, riding the wave of patriotic outrage, passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave Johnson broad military powers in Southeast Asia. Just like that, the Vietnam War escalated, legally. Decades later, declassified documents and recordings revealed what many suspected. The second attack likely never happened. Radar errors, misinterpreted signals, confusion at sea. Intelligence officials knew the reports were shaky. Johnson himself privately admitted, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." But the narrative had already done its work. The war machine was in motion. Over the next decade, more than 58,000 Americans and over 1 million Vietnamese would die. Entire villages destroyed. A country bombed into a cratered memory. And it all hinged on a ghost battle in the dark. One that may never have occurred. The myth was that the Gulf of Tonkin was a clear act of aggression. The truth? It was a blank check written in fog, signed in panic, and cashed in blood. And if one fabricated attack could unleash a war, what about a surveillance program denied for years? One that quietly rewrote the rules of privacy for an entire generation. 6. The NSA has been spying on Americans. At first, it sounded like something out of a spy novel with too many acronyms. The National Security Agency, a black box organization already known for secrecy, was accused of collecting massive amounts of data on U.S. citizens. Phone records, emails, browsing histories. The government denied it, over and over. Said it was targeted, minimal, necessary. The word metadata got tossed around like it was harmless. Just numbers, just patterns, nothing personal. Then came Edward Snowden. In 2013, the former NSA contractor leaked a trove of documents that changed everything. It turned out the NSA had built a sprawling surveillance apparatus, not just abroad but at home. Programs like PRISM, X-Keyscore, and Boundless Informant vacuumed up data from telecom companies, internet providers, and even cloud storage. The agency could monitor who you called, when you called, and where you were, all without a warrant, sometimes even without suspicion. The justification? National security. The 9/11 attacks had shifted the Overton window. What once seemed unconstitutional was now urgent. Congress played along. Courts looked the other way. Presidents, both red and blue, inherited the machinery and kept it running. When Snowden revealed the truth, the reaction split the country. Some called him a traitor, others a whistleblower. But no one could deny the facts. The U.S. government had, for years, conducted mass surveillance on its own citizens while insisting it hadn't. The language had just been sanitized. Targeted collection instead of dragnet. Minimized data instead of your entire digital life. The myth was that if you had nothing to hide, you had nothing to fear. The reality? Privacy isn't about guilt. It's about power. And once it's taken, it doesn't come back easily. But this wasn't the first time Americans were misled about the consequences of technology. Because before metadata, before digital tracking, there were fallout clouds, drifting silently across American skies, and the government said everything was fine. 7. The U.S. tested nuclear fallout on its own citizens. The official story was patriotic. The reality was radioactive. In the 1950s and early 60s, Nevada's desert shimmered under the mushroom clouds of America's nuclear ambitions. The bombs were tests, loud, bright, and heavily photographed. What didn't make the postcards were the people. Families in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. Farmers, ranchers, schoolchildren. Entire communities classified, unofficially, as downwinders. They were told the tests were safe, that the fallout would drift away, dissipate, dilute, that radiation was a distant problem, not one that would cling to soil, milk, and lungs. The Atomic Energy Commission, now extinct and not by coincidence, assured the public that precautions were in place. Scientists in lab coats smiled for newsreels. Generals gave thumbs up. America was strong. Science was in control. Except, it wasn't. From 1951 to 1962, the U.S. conducted nearly 100 above-ground nuclear tests at the Nevada test site. Fallout didn't just drift into uninhabited wastelands. It rode the wind. It settled on playgrounds. It landed on crops. Children played in snow that glowed, without knowing it wasn't snow. Livestock died. Cancer rates quietly climbed, but official reports shrugged. Just coincidence. Over time, internal documents surfaced. Memos revealed that government scientists knew the risks, that radiation levels in certain areas far exceeded safety thresholds, that milk in nearby towns carried dangerously high concentrations of iodine-131. But the testing continued. Because Cold War urgency trumped public health. The myth was that American soil was never part of the battlefield. The truth? The battlefield was wherever the wind blew. In the early 1990s, the federal government finally acknowledged partial responsibility. Some downwinders received compensation. Most didn't. The apology came slow, sanitized, and wrapped in red tape. And if that sounds familiar, you might recognize the pattern. A lie told long enough becomes public policy. Until someone, somewhere, leaks a memo, opens a box, or buries a loved one too young, too suddenly. But fallout doesn't just come from bombs. Sometimes it's paper trails, letters, tapes, threats, and sometimes it's sent in the mail, addressed to the dream of a better country. 8. The FBI harassed Martin Luther King Jr. History books like their heroes clean, preferably carved in stone and given a holiday. But Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just hated by Southern racists. He was feared by the federal government. And that fear turned into surveillance, sabotage, and blackmail. Cointelpro, the FBI's now infamous counterintelligence program, made King a primary target. Not because he advocated violence, but because he didn't. Because he was effective. Because he was changing minds. In private memos, J. Edgar Hoover called him the most dangerous Negro in America. Not for what he did, but for how many people listened. So they bugged his phones, infiltrated his staff, sent informants to record his meetings. They collected hotel records, recorded private conversations, and assembled a dossier meant not for law enforcement, but for personal destruction. Then they mailed him a letter, anonymously. It accused him of moral failure, and it strongly suggested that he should take himself out of the picture, permanently. He didn't. He marched on, from Selma to Washington to Memphis. But the surveillance never stopped. Even after his assassination in 1968, the FBI kept files open, not for historical record, but to shape the narrative. For decades, officials denied the extent of the harassment, said it was minimal, routine. Only after the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s and decades of activism did the full story emerge. Even then, some of the files remained sealed, redacted, buried. The myth was that America merely ignored King. The truth is worse. It tried to silence him. And if the FBI was willing to bend its resources toward undermining peaceful civil rights leaders, what about the rest of the intelligence community? What about the other global missions, the ones that funded secret wars through even stranger means? Because just as war makes money, so does chaos. Especially when it comes with a shipment of powder. 9. The CIA smuggled drugs. It sounds like a movie pitch rejected for being too cynical. The Central Intelligence Agency, defenders of freedom and democracy, working with drug traffickers to fund covert operations, denied for years, dismissed as conspiracy. Until the pieces, newspaper clippings, congressional hearings, witness testimony, began falling into place. The story begins in the 1980s. Nicaragua. The Cold War had shifted to Latin America, and the Reagan administration was determined to stop the spread of socialism. The Sandinista government, elected but left-leaning, was in the crosshairs. Enter the Contras, a ragtag group of anti-communist rebels with murky ethics and bloody tactics. Congress cut off funding. The CIA got creative. Through a now infamous series of maneuvers, some documented, some still denied, the agency supported the Contras through third parties, offshore accounts, and covert operations. But funding a secret war isn't cheap, and this is where the shadows thicken. Multiple investigations, including those by the Kerry Committee and journalist Gary Webb, pointed to a disturbing trend. CIA-linked figures turning a blind eye to drug trafficking. Planes that dropped off weapons in Central America returned filled with cocaine. That cocaine flooded into U.S. cities, particularly black communities already ravaged by poverty and over-policing. The crack epidemic didn't appear out of nowhere. It arrived in waves. Invisible at first, then undeniable. Webb's reporting in the mid-1990s was explosive. His Dark Alliance series suggested not just passive knowledge, but CIA complicity. He was attacked, discredited. His career collapsed. Years later, major outlets quietly confirmed key parts of his reporting. Too late. The CIA never admitted direct involvement in drug trafficking, but it acknowledged in internal documents that it turned a blind eye, that it prioritized geopolitical goals over domestic consequences, that it looked the other way, and let the consequences unfold in poor neighborhoods half a world away from the battlefield. The myth was that America fought drugs. The truth? Sometimes it used them. And if the lines between foreign wars and domestic disasters are that thin, what happens when the government itself sketches the plan to fake an attack, not just abroad, but here at home? 10. The U.S. planned false flag attacks. Terrorism is terrifying, but manufactured terrorism, the kind planned by your own government, adds a special chill. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on a plan called Operation Northwoods. It proposed a series of false flag attacks designed to rally American public support for a war against Cuba. The strategy? Stage fake terrorist incidents and blame them on Fidel Castro. The document, declassified decades later, reads like a script from a political thriller, one that ends with moral vertigo. The proposals were wide-ranging and bold, faking the hijacking of civilian planes, staging bombings in American cities, sinking a boat full of Cuban refugees, creating fake lists of casualties, even shooting down a drone painted to look like a commercial airliner and claiming it was full of Americans. All of it deliberately manufactured chaos designed to justify military intervention. This wasn't the work of fringe actors or some rogue faction. It came from the top, the Department of Defense, under the oversight of General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It reached the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The only reason it didn't happen? President Kennedy said no, and within a few months, Lemnitzer was quietly removed from his position and reassigned. For years, Americans dismissed such talk as pure fiction, the stuff of tinfoil hats and conspiracy forums. After all, why would a democratic government fake attacks on its own citizens? But when the Northwoods documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act, the myth died in black and white. The government had not only considered false flag attacks, it had planned them in detail. It's a story with no comfortable resolution. On one hand, it didn't happen. On the other, it could have. The machinery was there. The logic was rehearsed. The signatures were in place. So next time someone says, "Our government would never do that," consider that once, not long ago, they almost did. And if the government is willing to stage attacks to sway opinion, how far would it go to rewrite the economic narrative? Because beneath the patriotic myths lies a darker origin story, the one where wealth is built not just on labor, but on chains. 11. Slavery built the American economy. Some stories are whispered because shouting them would shake the whole house. For most of the 20th century, the mainstream story went like this. Slavery was tragic, yes, but it was mostly a Southern sin. A moral failure, not an economic engine. The North industrialized. The South grew cotton. Then came abolition, and eventually, progress. That was the script. Clean, linear, forgiving. But history, real history, doesn't comfort. It confronts. Slavery didn't just prop up the Southern plantation system. It laid the foundation for the entire American economy. Cotton, the cash crop of the 19th century, was the country's biggest export. And who picked it? Enslaved people. By hand. In brutal conditions. Their labor powered the textile mills of New England and fed the banks of Manhattan. The insurance industry? Born partly from policies taken out on enslaved lives. The shipping industry? Enriched by the transatlantic slave trade, moving human beings like cargo. Wall Street itself? Some of its earliest trades involved commodities financed by slave labor. Even universities, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, accepted donations from slaveholders or invested in slavery-adjacent industries. This wasn't a Southern thing. It was a national business model. Economists and historians, particularly in the last few decades, have laid it out with data, ledgers, and receipts. Enslaved people were not just laborers, they were assets. Collateral, financial instruments. They were bought, sold, leveraged, and insured. In some regions, their value exceeded that of all the railroads and factories combined. So when people ask why racial inequality persists, why wealth gaps endure, they often start the clock too late. The story doesn't begin in 1965 or 1865. It begins when American prosperity was measured not in wages, but in ownership of other human beings. The myth was that slavery was a tragic footnote. The truth? It was the economic prologue, and once you see that clearly, it gets harder to keep pointing fingers south. Because the North wasn't an innocent bystander. It was counting the profits too. 12. Northern states benefited from slavery. History likes regional villains. It makes absolution easier. For years, the South has borne the cultural weight of slavery. Confederate flags, plantation nostalgia, Civil War reenactments with suspicious loyalties. Meanwhile, the North, particularly New England, wrapped itself in the aura of moral superiority. Abolitionists. Freedom trails. Liberty bells. That's the version you get in textbooks. But the economic record tells another story. Boston merchants owned shares in slave ships. Rhode Island was a hub of the transatlantic slave trade, with hundreds of voyages launching from its ports. New York banks provided loans secured by enslaved people. Northern insurance companies issued policies on enslaved lives. And textile mills across Massachusetts and Connecticut ran on Southern cotton, picked by enslaved hands. The Northern elite may not have cracked the whip, but they certainly counted the returns. Even as abolitionist movements gained traction, many in the North resisted change if it threatened business. Laws were passed to return escaped slaves. Black residents were segregated, denied voting rights, and subjected to violent backlash. Not in Mississippi, but in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Anti-black riots erupted in northern cities during the Civil War. The North, in many ways, feared emancipation's economic and social consequences as much as the South did. This wasn't passive complicity. It was active participation. Today, some of those institutions, banks, universities, corporations, are issuing public apologies, funding research, or setting up restitution initiatives. But the wealth remains. The buildings stand. The myth of moral distance has simply aged better than the truth. So while the South bore the shame, the North often kept the receipts. And if whole regions could rewrite their own role in one of the darkest chapters of American history, what else got buried? What communities were wiped off the map? Not just in storybooks, but in actual flames. 13. There were race massacres, and they were covered up. They weren't riots, they were massacres, organized, calculated, and erased. For most of the 20th century, when Americans learned about racial violence, it was packaged in vague euphemisms: unrest, disturbance, uprising. The word riot appeared in textbooks, often without context, implying mutual aggression, as if black communities simply clashed with their white neighbors in unfortunate moments of misunderstanding. That version, of course, leaves out the part where homes were burned, businesses destroyed, and entire neighborhoods annihilated by white mobs, often with the silent blessing of law enforcement. Tulsa, 1921. In the neighborhood of Greenwood, Oklahoma, known then as Black Wall Street, a thriving black community stood as a symbol of black prosperity and autonomy. That, in itself, was the problem. After a false accusation against a young black man, a white mob stormed the district. Planes dropped incendiaries. Armed men burned homes and businesses. In less than 24 hours, over 1,000 buildings were destroyed. Death estimates range from dozens to several hundred. Survivors were rounded up and held in internment camps. The event was so thoroughly erased that even descendants didn't hear about it until decades later. Wilmington, 1898. A city in North Carolina with a majority black population, democratically elected black officials, and a multiracial government. That didn't sit well with white supremacists, who orchestrated a coup, the only successful one in American history. They burned the black-owned newspaper, assassinated officials, and forced others to flee. The state government did nothing. The national government said less. Textbooks called it a riot. It was not. Rosewood, 1923. A small black town in Florida. A lie spread that a black man had attacked a white woman. The result? A mob descended, homes were torched, families fled into the swamps, and the town was wiped off the map. Survivors were threatened into silence. For years, it was a ghost story, whispered but never officially acknowledged. These weren't isolated incidents. Dozens of similar massacres occurred between Reconstruction and the Great Depression. In Chicago, East St. Louis, Atlanta, Detroit. But they weren't treated as national tragedies. They were buried, sometimes literally. The myth was that race riots were chaotic outbursts, unfortunate but mutual. The truth? Many were organized campaigns of racial terror meant to reverse black progress by force. And it worked. Communities lost wealth, land, history, and America conveniently forgot. But not everything stayed buried. Some truths clawed their way back into the conversation, like the reason the Civil War was actually fought, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. 14. The Civil War was about slavery. For over a century, the phrase states' rights acted as the country's most successful historical rebrand. It sounded noble, constitutional, even libertarian. It was the cornerstone of lost cause mythology. The idea that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but about the South defending its rights against federal overreach. A compelling tale taught in schools, etched into monuments, and sold in gift shops. And it's wrong. Confederate leaders weren't vague about their motives. They wrote them down, in speeches, in constitutions, in letters to one another. When Mississippi seceded, their declaration stated, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Alexander Stephens, the Confederacy's vice president, delivered the infamous cornerstone speech, in which he declared that the Confederacy was built on the truth that black people were inferior and slavery was their natural condition. The idea that the war was about tariffs or abstract federalism doesn't survive contact with the actual documents. Secession wasn't just political. It was existential for a slaveholding elite whose economic and social power depended entirely on human bondage. When Lincoln was elected, they panicked. Not because he promised immediate emancipation, he didn't, but because his presidency threatened the expansion of slavery into new territories. That's what they feared, containment. The North didn't go to war to free the enslaved, at least not at first. It went to war to preserve the Union, but the South went to war to preserve slavery. The record is clear. The fighting may have been over geography and sovereignty, but the cause was slavery. Why the lie? Because after the war, the South lost the battle but fought hard to win the memory. Confederate veterans formed heritage organizations. Statues went up not immediately after the war, but during Jim Crow, political statements in bronze. Textbooks were edited. Teachers were instructed to present both sides. The myth of the noble South, fighting for honor, became a national story, and for generations it stuck. The myth was comforting. The truth remains uncomfortable. The Civil War was fought over slavery, explicitly, overwhelmingly, and unapologetically. And when the war ended, slavery was abolished, but not erased. Because the next battle wasn't on the battlefield. It was in ballots, laws, and night rides. And this time, the sabotage came in suits, robes, and torches. 15. Reconstruction was sabotaged. It was supposed to be a new beginning. What it became was a carefully orchestrated return to the old order. Reconstruction, the 12-year period after the Civil War, was America's brief experiment in multiracial democracy, and it nearly worked. Black men voted. They held office. Schools were opened. Towns rebuilt. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments promised citizenship, equality, and the right to vote. The possibility of a different America was on the table. But possibility is fragile when power feels threatened. From the moment it began, Reconstruction was under siege. White supremacist groups, most famously the Ku Klux Klan, used terror to keep black citizens from voting. Churches were burned. Politicians were assassinated. Intimidation wasn't a side effect. It was strategy. Meanwhile, Northern willpower faded. Once the Union had won the war, many white Northerners lost interest in fighting the peace. Racism wasn't confined by the Mason-Dixon line, and sympathy for black freedom often buckled under economic downturns and political exhaustion. The federal government slowly retreated. Troops were withdrawn. Promises were broken. Southern states passed black codes, laws that criminalized everything from unemployment to loitering, funneling black men into a new system of labor through prison leasing. Politicians struck deals, like the Compromise of 1877, which handed the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for ending federal oversight in the South. The result? Jim Crow. For decades, the myth was that Reconstruction failed because freed people weren't ready, too inexperienced, too disorganized. But the real failure wasn't black leadership. It was white backlash. It wasn't incompetence. It was sabotage. And the most insidious part? Many of those who dismantled Reconstruction did it through the same system that had promised equality. Courts, elections, law enforcement, America didn't just turn its back on Reconstruction, it weaponized its institutions to reverse it. The myth was that the war ended, freedom began, and things gradually improved. The truth is that freedom was brief, and then beaten back. And if Reconstruction could be undone by the same system that created it, what about the laws that replaced it? Were they custom, or were they codified? Because the next chapter wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, and it wore the robe of legitimacy. 16. Jim Crow wasn't just Southern tradition. For decades, Americans learned to think of Jim Crow as a kind of regional eccentricity, like grits or magnolia trees. A Southern issue, a historical hiccup, something ugly, yes, but contained. The truth, of course, is far colder. Jim Crow was not tradition. It was law, it was infrastructure, and it was national in its silence. After the collapse of Reconstruction, a legal architecture of racial segregation swept across the South. State legislatures, now back in white hands, moved swiftly to draw a line through every facet of life. Separate schools, separate restrooms, separate hospitals, drinking fountains, train cars, waiting rooms, libraries, parks, cemeteries, all codified into law. Not suggestions, not customs, statutes, enforceable, prosecutable. This wasn't about states simply choosing their way of life. It was about enforcing racial hierarchy with the weight of government. It was about defining blackness, not as a culture, but as a legal liability. Separate but equal was the mantra. The reality? Separate and deliberately inferior. The U.S. Supreme Court stamped its approval in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, ruling that segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities were equal. A loophole so broad you could drive an entire system of apartheid through it. And they did. For almost 60 years, the court didn't just allow segregation, it enabled it. Police enforced these laws with force. Courts upheld them. Local governments used them to manipulate voting districts, suppress turnout, and maintain economic control. Entire generations grew up in a system designed to keep Black Americans physically, socially, and economically confined. And while Jim Crow is often presented as a relic of the Old South, it found plenty of silent allies elsewhere. Northern cities had de facto segregation, restrictive housing covenants, school zoning designed to preserve racial divides, and unwritten rules just as rigid as those written in Southern codes. The difference? Northern racism dressed better. The myth was that Jim Crow was about Southern culture. The truth is that it was about power, legal, systemic, and upheld by the highest court in the land. And that power didn't just hide in institutions. Sometimes it dressed in robes and hoods, and showed up at town hall meetings. 17. The KKK infiltrated local governments. We tend to think of the Ku Klux Klan as a fringe group. Hooded figures marching through backwoods roads, burning crosses under the cover of night. An image frozen in grainy black and white, archived in a past we'd like to think we've outgrown. But the Klan wasn't just a vigilante group. It was a political machine. At its peak in the 1920s, the Klan had between 3 and 5 million members, not just in the Deep South, but across the Midwest, the West Coast, and the industrial North. Cities like Denver, Indianapolis, and Detroit had active chapters. In some places, Klan-endorsed candidates won mayoral elections. Governors received support. Senators sought their approval. In Indiana, Grand Dragon D.C. Stevenson effectively controlled the state's Republican Party. In Colorado, the Klan helped elect a governor, a mayor, and several legislators. In Oregon, they pushed through laws banning private Catholic schools, targeting immigrants and religious minorities under the guise of Americanism. Police chiefs, judges, and city council members joined their ranks, not in secret but proudly. Klan membership was a political resume booster. Even more unsettling, some members of law enforcement weren't just sympathetic to the Klan, they were in it. Officers turned a blind eye to violence, or worse, participated in it. Black communities knew the danger wasn't just the man in the hood, It was the one with the badge. This wasn't accidental. It was the plan. The Klan's second wave wasn't just about intimidation. It was about legitimacy. By infiltrating the political system, they didn't need to act like outlaws. They could write the laws. Eventually, the Klan's influence waned, fractured by scandal, internal corruption, and shifting public opinion. But its fingerprints remained in policy, in networks, in habits of governance that outlasted the robes and rallies. The myth was that the Klan was an underground cult of hate. The truth? It was often above ground, in office, and holding the gavel. And if people in power were willing to wear the hood by night and write policy by day, what did they do with maps? With zoning laws? With bank loans and home deeds? The answer, of course, is they drew lines. 18. Redlining was federally endorsed. It wasn't subtle. It was a literal line drawn on a map. In the 1930s, as the United States tried to recover from the Great Depression, the federal government launched the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, to help stabilize housing. The idea was to assess neighborhoods and determine where mortgage assistance should be directed. The result? Color-coded maps that graded neighborhoods A through D. Best areas were green, still desirable were blue, definitely declining were yellow, and hazardous? Red. Hence the name, redlining. The criteria weren't just about income or property condition. They were about race. HOLC maps explicitly referenced the presence of Black, immigrant, and Jewish families as reasons to downgrade a neighborhood. Banks took note. So did real estate agents. Insurance companies followed suit. If you lived in a red-line district, you were unlikely to get a loan, regardless of your income or savings. And since Black Americans were disproportionately placed in those areas, the result was devastating. Generations of families were locked out of homeownership, the primary engine of middle-class wealth in the 20th century. This wasn't just private sector discrimination, it was federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration used HOLC maps to decide where to insure loans. The GI Bill, hailed as a model of post-war prosperity, overwhelmingly benefited white veterans, while Black veterans were steered into poorer neighborhoods or denied benefits altogether. The myth was that housing discrimination was accidental, or at worst, the fault of a few bad actors. The truth is it was deliberate, bureaucratic, and systemic. The legacy of redlining still echoes today, in wealth gaps, school funding, healthcare access, and infrastructure investment. Zip codes remain predictive of life outcomes, and those zip codes were drawn with prejudice baked in. And if the maps were rigged, then what else was? What other system said freedom on paper but kept people bound in different ways? Because if you thought slavery ended in 1863, think again. 19. Slavery didn't end in 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation gets all the spotlight. Lincoln's signature, the grand gesture, the moment school children memorize as the end of slavery in the United States. But that was only the press release. The fine print told a different story. For starters, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states in active rebellion, not to the border states that still held enslaved people. And even in the Confederacy, it couldn't be enforced until Union troops arrived. Real emancipation didn't take hold until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. But even then, there was a catch. A single clause that would become one of the most legally exploited loopholes in American history. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. That exception, 11 words buried in legalese, opened the door for a new kind of bondage. Across the South, states began passing laws known as black codes. These laws criminalized vague offenses like vagrancy and loitering, targeting newly freed black people who didn't have proof of employment or residence. Once arrested, they could be fined. If they couldn't pay, and most couldn't, they were leased out to private companies, coal mines, railroads, plantations, convict leasing it was called. But it wasn't much different from what had come before. This wasn't slavery in disguise. It was slavery by design. The system became wildly profitable. States made money leasing prisoners to corporations. Companies made money on unpaid labor. Sheriffs were incentivized to arrest more people. And black communities were caught in a cycle of criminalization and exploitation that would stretch from the 19th century into the 20th, and in different forms, arguably, into the present. Even outside of prisons, other systems emerged. Sharecropping contracts that left families in perpetual debt. Peonage systems where workers were trapped on plantations through fraudulent debts and threats. Forced apprenticeships that removed black children from their homes under flimsy pretenses. The myth was that slavery ended with a signature. The truth is that it mutated, shape-shifted, and found cover in new language. And if the law could be twisted to maintain control over labor, what else could it do? What happens when the law isn't just slow to change, but actively used to control who can reproduce? 20. The U.S. forcibly sterilized thousands. It wasn't a secret. It was a policy. From the early 20th century through the 1970s, state-run eugenics programs across the United States authorized the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 people, most of them poor, disabled, mentally ill, or people of color. It wasn't done in alleyways or basements. It was done in hospitals, with forms, under the supervision of medical professionals, backed by state legislatures, endorsed by courts. The rationale? Genetic improvement. The belief that certain traits, poverty, mental illness, criminality, were hereditary and could be eliminated by preventing unfit people from reproducing. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, but it was real and widespread. More than 30 states passed sterilization laws. California led the way. Victims were often institutionalized, committed for reasons ranging from developmental disabilities to simple nonconformity. Some were told the surgeries were routine. Others were threatened with indefinite confinement unless they consented. Consent, in most cases, was a technicality. The goal was to quietly reduce populations deemed undesirable. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of these programs in Buck v. Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the now infamous words, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That sentence justified decades of sterilizations and set a global precedent. Even the Nazi regime cited American eugenics laws as a model. The practice disproportionately targeted Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women. In North Carolina, the program continued into the 1970s, sterilizing girls as young as 14. In Puerto Rico, where U.S. health officials launched aggressive sterilization campaigns, by the mid-20th century, over 1/3 of all women of childbearing age had been sterilized. The myth was that eugenics was a fringe idea that never took hold. The truth? It was policy, written into law, funded by the government, and executed under the guise of public health. Today, some survivors have received compensation. Others never even knew what had been taken from them. And if that's what the government was willing to do to its own citizens under the banner of health and science, what does that say about decisions made at the very top, by those entrusted with the highest powers of office? 21. FDR knew about Japanese internment abuses. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal titan, the wartime leader, the face on the dime, also signed Executive Order 9066. That order authorized the forced removal and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast during World War II. Many were citizens. Most had never shown any sign of disloyalty. None were charged with crimes, but they were uprooted, imprisoned, and labeled a threat, simply for their ancestry. The myth for years was that FDR acted in ignorance, that the order was an unfortunate wartime overreaction, a decision made in haste, under pressure, and with incomplete information. But the records tell a different story. Military advisors, intelligence agencies, and even FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover warned that mass internment wasn't necessary. There was no evidence of widespread disloyalty among Japanese Americans. Internal reports from the Navy and Justice Department argued that existing surveillance measures were sufficient. FDR read those reports. He signed the order anyway. What followed was one of the most sweeping violations of civil liberties in U.S. history. Entire families were forced to abandon homes, businesses, and possessions. Some had days' notice. Many never recovered their property. They were relocated to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, where they remained for years, not because they had done anything wrong, but because America had decided their ethnicity was reason enough. The internment wasn't a wartime necessity. It was a political calculation, driven by racism, fear, and pressure from West Coast politicians and agricultural interests eager to remove Japanese competition. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized and provided limited reparations. But no apology can erase the truth that the highest office in the land knowingly signed off on collective punishment. The myth was that FDR simply didn't know. The truth is, he knew, and chose to proceed anyway. And that decision wasn't isolated, because behind the polished images of presidents lie secrets, conditions, and cover-ups carefully hidden, especially when it came to the health of a nation's young, charismatic leader. 22. JFK's health was far worse than reported. He looked like the picture of American vigor. Young, handsome, tan, sailing off Cape Cod with the wind in his hair and destiny in his teeth. That was the image, the myth. The reality? John F. Kennedy was a man in constant, often excruciating pain, so medicated, so physically compromised that at times he could barely stand without help. And nearly no one knew. During his presidency, the public saw Camelot. What they didn't see were the amphetamines, barbiturates, steroids, and painkillers coursing through his system. They didn't hear about the Addison's disease, a life-threatening adrenal disorder that he concealed throughout his political career. They weren't told about the back surgeries, the infections, or the near-death episodes that dotted his timeline from World War II onward. Kennedy's health issues began early. Childhood illnesses, chronic colitis, a bad back made worse by war injuries. By the time he was elected to the Senate, he was already dependent on a regimen of injections and pills to get through the day. When he ran for president in 1960, rumors swirled, but his campaign denied them. His team even leaked a clean bill of health, signed by a friendly doctor. The public never saw the full picture. They didn't see the crutches, or the fact that JFK often wore a back brace so stiff it prevented him from bending at the waist. Even his doctors maintained a code of silence. It wasn't just political strategy. It was image preservation. After his death, files trickled out. Biographers dug deeper. White House physicians eventually admitted what had long been whispered in the halls. The president was, quite literally, held together by pharmaceuticals. This raises uncomfortable questions. Not just about transparency, but about power. What does it mean when the most powerful man in the country is physically compromised? What decisions were made under the haze of medication? What risks were taken because of pain, exhaustion, or euphoria? The myth was that Kennedy represented youthful vitality. The truth? He was a man battling his own body every single day, and winning just long enough to hide it. And while his personal struggles were concealed, the decisions of other presidents involved concealment of a different kind. Not of pain, but of politics, and sabotage carried out in secret. 23. Nixon sabotaged Vietnam peace talks. In the fall of 1968, the Vietnam War was grinding through its fourth brutal year. Lyndon B. Johnson, exhausted and unpopular, had stepped away from the campaign. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was running against Republican challenger Richard Nixon. As the election neared, Johnson was working to negotiate a breakthrough peace deal with North Vietnam, a deal that might have ended the war. And then, suddenly, everything stalled. Behind the scenes, Nixon's campaign was in contact with South Vietnamese leaders. The message was clear: stall the peace talks. If you hold off until after the election, You'll get a better deal under a Nixon administration. This wasn't speculation. It was confirmed by FBI wiretaps, declassified documents, and later accounts from Nixon aides. They called it the Chennault Affair, named after Anna Chennault, the campaign's go-between. Johnson knew. He had the intercepts. He called it treason, in private. But he didn't go public. To do so would have meant revealing the surveillance program that captured the conversations. So he stayed silent, and Nixon won the election. The Paris peace talks collapsed. The war continued for another 5 years. Tens of thousands more American soldiers died, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. All because Nixon decided peace was less important than power. The myth was that the 1968 election was won on merit, on policy, on a secret plan to end the war. The truth? It was won in part by undermining peace for political gain. And if that sounds cynical, wait until you hear what happened a decade later, when hostages, arms deals, and another presidential campaign collided in a different kind of October surprise. 24. Reagan's campaign delayed hostage release. The Iranian hostage crisis haunted Jimmy Carter's presidency. For 444 days, 52 Americans were held captive in Tehran. Their fate broadcast nightly on TV, their suffering turned into political theater. Carter, unable to secure their release, became a symbol of impotence in the eyes of many Americans. Ronald Reagan, the charismatic challenger, seized on that narrative. But behind the curtain, something deeper may have been unfolding. The allegation: members of Reagan's 1980 campaign engaged in secret communications with Iranian intermediaries, urging them to delay the release of the hostages until after the election. The idea was simple. A last-minute release would boost Carter. A delay would humiliate him. There were whispers of this at the time, dismissed, of course, as conspiracy. But over the years, testimony began to pile up. Former officials, intelligence sources, even Iranian figures hinted that a back channel may have existed. Congress investigated in the early 1990s, but the inquiry was limited and inconclusive. The final report? No credible evidence. But many researchers, and some former officials, remained unconvinced. What is undeniable is the timing. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day Reagan was sworn in. To the hour. It was celebrated as a triumph of strength and resolve. Reagan's team denied any involvement. But the optics? Perfect. If true, it would mean that American citizens were kept in captivity longer for political advantage. That a campaign prioritized victory over human lives. That diplomacy was hijacked for electoral calculus. The myth was that Reagan's tough stance brought the hostages home. The truth may be far more strategic and far more unsettling. And if political gain could be prioritized over peace and people, what else was traded in secret? What deals were made with enemies, not to end conflict, but to keep it just long enough to benefit the right hands? 25. Reagan traded arms for hostages. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan stood at the podium and delivered lines about American strength, about never negotiating with terrorists, about drawing a hard line against rogue regimes. And behind the scenes, his administration was selling weapons to Iran, the very nation whose revolutionaries had once held American citizens hostage. This is not speculation. It's not an interpretation of murky intelligence. It's a confirmed historical fact known as the Iran-Contra affair, one of the most convoluted and audacious scandals in modern American history, not because of how it was covered up, but because of how long it was denied. Here's what happened. Iran was at war with Iraq, and it desperately needed weapons. Officially, the U.S. had an arms embargo against Iran. But unofficially, Reagan's administration saw an opportunity. By using Israeli intermediaries and secret channels, American-made missiles were quietly funneled to Iran. In return, Iranian intermediaries would allegedly pressure Hezbollah to release American hostages held in Lebanon. But it didn't stop there. The money from the weapons sales didn't go back into the U.S. Treasury. It was diverted, illegally, to fund the Contras, a right-wing rebel group in Nicaragua fighting the socialist Sandinista government. Congress had already passed the Boland Amendment, specifically banning U.S. aid to the Contras. But the Reagan administration found a workaround: sell weapons, get money, fund rebels. In public, Reagan denied everything. "We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons for hostages," he said in a televised address. The denials were firm, patriotic, unyielding, until they weren't. In 1986, the story broke. Investigations followed. Documents surfaced. Oliver North, a Marine Corps officer and member of the National Security Council, became the face of the scandal, shredding memos, lying to Congress, and eventually testifying in full dress uniform with a calm demeanor and a conveniently foggy memory. He became a folk hero in some circles. Others saw him as a symbol of how far the executive branch had drifted from accountability. Multiple administration officials were indicted. Some were convicted. All were later pardoned, most notably by President George H.W. Bush, who, as it turned out, had also known far more about the operation than he let on. The myth was that Reagan's leadership rested on moral clarity. The truth? His administration engaged in secret arms deals with hostile nations and illegally funded foreign wars, all while standing in front of the cameras and promising the opposite. And if the vice president knew all along, what happens when that man becomes president? Does the scandal stop, or does the silence get deeper? 26. George H.W. Bush knew about Iran-Contra. He said he was out of the loop. That was George H.W. Bush's phrase. Carefully chosen, heavily repeated. As vice president during the Reagan administration, Bush was asked what he knew about the illegal arms sales to Iran and the diversion of funds to the Contras. His answer was consistent. He was kept in the dark, but the documents tell a different story. Bush had a seat on the National Security Council. He attended meetings where arms sales and hostage negotiations were discussed. He kept personal diaries, later released, where he described the arms for hostages arrangement as very controversial and something they needed to keep the lid on. Not the words of someone entirely unaware, more the words of someone aware enough to worry. As investigations into Iran-Contra deepened, many wondered why Bush emerged largely unscathed. While other officials were subpoenaed, charged, or publicly disgraced, Bush sidestepped the scandal with practiced calm. He distanced himself, carefully, surgically, from the operation, even as circumstantial evidence suggested involvement. When he became president in 1989, one of his first major acts related to the scandal was to issue pardons. On Christmas Eve 1992, he pardoned 6 former officials involved in Iran-Contra, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, just days before Weinberger was set to stand trial. The move shut down the investigation. It protected key players, and it buried what could have been deeper revelations. Critics saw the pardons as obstruction by another name, a final act of self-preservation. Even Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel investigating the affair, called the move a cover-up. But the news cycle moved on. The Cold War was ending, the economy was wobbly, and political scandals, it turns out, have expiration dates, especially when they involve polite men in suits and not criminal mugshots. The myth was that Bush was a steady hand, untouched by the messiness of Iran-Contra. The truth? He may have been one of its quieter architects, not with orders barked down a hallway, but with nods, meetings, memos, and well-timed silence. And if presidents can deny knowing about secret wars, what happens when the lies are personal? Not global strategy, but human relationships. And televised denials that turn into impeachments. 27. Bill Clinton had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. It began as rumor, then a denial, then a scandal that consumed the American political psyche for over a year. It was a story about power, privacy, and perjury, and about how a personal failing became a constitutional crisis. In 1998, President Bill Clinton was accused of having an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern. When the story broke, Clinton faced reporters, wagged his finger, and declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." The statement became one of the most infamous in presidential history. But he had, and the evidence, including recorded phone calls, testimony, and yes, a certain blue dress, contradicted his denial. At the heart of the scandal wasn't just the affair, but the cover-up. Clinton was under investigation for unrelated matters when the Lewinsky revelation emerged. He denied the relationship under oath, opening himself to charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. That's what led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives, not the relationship itself, but the lie. The Senate ultimately acquitted him. He remained in office. His approval ratings actually rose. Some saw the ordeal as political theater, others as moral reckoning, and still others as a referendum on privacy in an increasingly invasive media age. The myth, peddled for months, was that the allegations were false, a smear campaign. The truth? Clinton lied repeatedly and got caught, not in private, but in the most public way possible. The fallout was political and cultural. It redefined public expectations of presidential accountability, and it foreshadowed an era where personal scandal would no longer disqualify a political career. It might even galvanize it. And if that was how the government handled one lie, what happens when the next one leads not to a scandal, but to a war? When a manufactured threat isn't about personal shame, but about weapons that never existed. 28. The Bush administration misled the public about WMDs. It started with the phrase, "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud." That line, delivered by National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice in 2002, encapsulated the fear-based rationale for launching a war against Iraq. Saddam Hussein, Americans were told, possessed weapons of mass destruction. He was hiding chemical weapons. He was pursuing nuclear bombs. He was preparing to use them, or hand them to terrorists, at any moment. The claims weren't vague. They were precise. Satellite images were shown to the UN inspectors. Aluminum tubes, mobile weapons labs, secret stockpiles buried in the sand. Vice President Dick Cheney went on national TV and said with confidence, "There is no doubt." Secretary of State Colin Powell, a respected figure across party lines, made the case at the UN with charts, photos, and solemn gravitas. The problem? It wasn't true. After the 2003 invasion, American forces swept through Iraq expecting to find stockpiles of chemical weapons. They didn't. No biological labs, no nuclear program, no mushroom cloud. The intelligence had been wrong, or more accurately, selectively interpreted to fit a preordained policy. Dissenting analysts had been ignored or silenced. Nuance was scrubbed in favor of certainty. An entire war was sold on the premise of WMDs. The Bush administration didn't just rely on flawed intelligence. They leaned into it, exaggerated it, cherry-picked it. They created a narrative too powerful to stop, even when the facts started to wobble. And the cost? Over 4,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths, a country destabilized, a region thrown into chaos, and a global reputation shredded. Years later, various commissions and bipartisan panels would confirm what critics had been shouting from the beginning. The intelligence was manipulated. The public had been misled. But by then, the damage was done. The phrase, "weapons of mass destruction," had become a punchline, a tragic symbol of how a superpower can lie itself into war. The myth was that Iraq had WMDs. The truth? America had talking points. And while bombs were falling overseas, something quieter was happening in the sky, above countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. Unseen, unspoken, until the targets turned out to be civilians. 29. Obama ordered drone strikes that killed civilians. He campaigned on transparency. He promised accountability. And then, under the cover of modern warfare, Barack Obama expanded one of the most opaque and controversial military programs in American history, the drone strike. At first glance, drones seemed like the perfect solution to the messy problem of terrorism. No boots on the ground, no body bags returning home. Just surgical strikes on high-value targets in remote areas of Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Precision warfare. Clean, efficient, moral. Except it wasn't. The drone program, which expanded dramatically under Obama's administration, operated largely in secret. The criteria for targeting were classified. The legal framework? Ambiguous at best. Even the kill lists, yes, that's what they were called, were reviewed in meetings described by insiders as Terror Tuesday, where officials debated which suspected terrorists should be next. The problem was the word suspected. Intelligence was often shaky. Targets were sometimes identified based on behavior patterns or cell phone metadata. And yes, American citizens were killed, including a 16-year-old in Yemen. No charges, no trial, just a strike. Civilian casualties were frequently denied or minimized. At one point, the administration redefined militant to include any military-age male in a strike zone, unless posthumously proven otherwise. It was bureaucratic logic that turned errors into acceptable losses. The American public remained largely unaware of the scope and scale. Journalists struggled to report on the program due to secrecy. Human rights groups called for transparency. And yet the program continued, with few checks and almost no oversight. Obama later expressed discomfort with the program's ethical gray zones. In his memoir, he reflected on the moral weight of ordering deaths via remote control. But during his presidency, he oversaw more than 500 drone strikes, many of which killed civilians. The myth was that drone strikes were precise and accountable. The truth? They were shadow wars, fought without debate, waged without borders, and shrouded in layers of official denial. And if invisible wars could be justified in the name of national security, what happens when a president decides to test the boundaries of democracy itself? Not in foreign lands, but at home. 30. Trump tried to overturn an election. At first it was just noise. A tweet here, a press conference there, claims of fraud, allegations with no evidence. The 2020 election was called for Joe Biden, and Donald Trump refused to accept it. Many assumed it was just bluster, a refusal to concede from a man whose brand was built on grievance. But what began as denial quickly became something else, a coordinated attempt to subvert the results of a democratic election. The campaign included pressure on state officials to find votes. Trump called Georgia's Secretary of State and asked him to recalculate. He summoned legislators to the White House, hoping they'd overturn their own state's results. Lawsuits were filed, dozens of them, and almost all were thrown out for lack of evidence. Then came the fake electors scheme. In multiple swing states, unauthorized groups of Trump loyalists submitted forged electoral certificates to the National Archives, hoping to create confusion and delay certification. Meanwhile, inside the Justice Department, Trump tried to install loyalists who would support his claims. When that failed, he turned to Vice President Mike Pence, pressuring him to reject electoral votes on January 6, 2021, a power Pence did not have. And then, of course, there was the Capitol. A rally turned into a riot. A crowd turned into a mob. They breached the Capitol building, halted the certification, and chanted for the vice president to be removed. And while Trump eventually told them to go home, hours later, he had spent months fanning the flames that lit that day. For weeks, pundits dismissed the idea that a sitting president could genuinely attempt a coup. But in hindsight, that's exactly what happened. An attempt, not just to question the results, but to stay in power by any means necessary. The myth was that American democracy was unshakable. The truth? It came terrifyingly close to the edge. And if that's what happened in the political arena, imagine what had already been allowed to happen in the name of commerce, health, and science, right under the public's nose, for decades. 31. Lead in gasoline poison generations. At first, it seemed like a miracle ingredient. In the 1920s, engineers at General Motors discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline could prevent engine knocking, that annoying pinging noise that comes from premature combustion. It was a breakthrough, they said. Cars ran smoother. Engines lasted longer. The fuel industry rejoiced. The problem? It was toxic. Not just a little toxic. Profoundly, neurologically damaging, and they knew. From the beginning, scientists raised red flags. Workers in leaded gasoline plants suffered hallucinations, seizures, and deaths. One GM facility was nicknamed the Looney Gas Building because so many employees went mad. Public health experts warned that dispersing lead into the atmosphere via car exhaust might poison cities over time. The response from the industry? Denial, deflection, and a carefully orchestrated PR campaign. Companies like GM, Standard Oil, and DuPont joined forces to downplay the risks. They funded friendly scientists. They created front organizations. They insisted that there was no conclusive evidence that leaded gas was harmful when used properly. They framed critics as alarmists and radicals. Meanwhile, millions of cars were spewing microscopic particles of lead into the air. Particles that would settle into soil, seep into homes, and find their way into children's bloodstreams. By the 1960s, the damage was becoming harder to ignore. Lead levels in urban children were alarmingly high. Researchers like Claire Patterson, a geochemist studying atmospheric lead, found that modern humans had hundreds of times more lead in their bodies than people from ancient times. His work was met with resistance, not just from industry, but from government agencies with ties to those industries. It wasn't until the 1970s that the Environmental Protection Agency began phasing out leaded gasoline. The lead industry fought tooth and nail, but eventually unleaded fuel became standard, and as leaded gas declined, so did blood lead levels in children. Dramatically, the link was undeniable. The myth was that leaded gasoline was a harmless innovation. The truth? It was a slow-motion public health disaster, one that likely impaired cognitive development across entire generations, disproportionately affecting low-income and urban communities. And this wasn't an isolated case. Because just as the oil and car industries buried the truth about lead, another powerful industry was knowingly selling death, with a smile, a filter, and a catchy slogan. 32. Big Tobacco knew cigarettes were deadly. For decades, the tobacco industry told Americans that smoking was safe, even healthy. Ads showed doctors lighting up. Celebrities endorsed their favorite brands. Cartoons pitched cigarettes to kids. It was all part of an expertly crafted illusion, one that unraveled only when the industry's own documents betrayed them. By the 1950s, independent studies had begun linking smoking to lung cancer. The tobacco companies responded by creating a public relations group called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a name that sounded scientific but was designed to confuse. Their strategy was simple: create doubt. If they could convince the public that the science wasn't settled, they could keep selling cigarettes for decades. Internally, though, they knew. Memos from the 1960s and 70s show executives acknowledging that nicotine was addictive and that smoking caused cancer. One document famously read, "We are in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." Another stated that denying these links was essential to survival, not just of the industry, but of the entire marketing ecosystem that supported it. So they leaned in. They funded junk science. They attacked researchers. They created ad campaigns targeting teenagers, knowing that brand loyalty started young. They designed cigarettes to be more addictive, adjusting nicotine delivery with chemistry that rivaled any pharmaceutical company. And all the while they swore to Congress that they didn't believe smoking was harmful. It wasn't until the 1990s, when whistleblowers came forward and states began suing, that the full scope of the deception was revealed. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 forced major tobacco companies to pay billions of dollars and curtail advertising. But by then, the damage was vast. Millions had died. Millions more were hooked. The myth was that smoking was a personal choice, free of manipulation. The truth? It was an industry that spent decades engineering addiction and lying about it, even as their customers were dying, and tobacco wasn't alone. Another killer lurked in the walls, in the ceiling tiles, in the very air people breathed, and the people who profited knew that too. 33. Asbestos is deadly. And they covered it up. It was called a miracle mineral. Asbestos was fireproof, flexible, and cheap. It was used in everything: insulation, roofing, floor tiles, brake pads, even baby powder. For decades it was considered essential, not just to construction but to modern life. What no one mentioned, or at least not publicly, was that it was also deadly. As early as the 1930s, medical researchers had begun linking asbestos exposure to severe lung diseases, including asbestosis and a rare aggressive cancer called mesothelioma. The fibers were microscopic and virtually indestructible. Once inhaled, they lodged deep in the lungs and stayed there, slowly, silently, killing. The companies knew. Internal memos from major asbestos manufacturers, like Johns Manville and Asbestos, revealed that executives were aware of the health risks decades before the public. In one 1966 document, an official wrote, "If you have enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?" They laughed it off. They kept selling it. And they fought to keep warnings off product labels. Lawsuits began to mount in the 1970s, but the industry pushed back. They hired scientists, paid off lobbyists, denied responsibility, and, where possible, blamed the victims. Workers who hadn't worn masks, contractors who hadn't followed the proper protocols, communities that should have known better. Never mind that most of those workers were never told the full risks in the first place. By the 1980s, asbestos was being phased out in many products, and stricter regulations were put in place. But a full ban in the United States? It never happened. As of now, asbestos remains legal in small amounts and continues to be used in some industrial applications. The myth was that asbestos was safe if used correctly. The truth? It was always hazardous, and the companies that profited from it were willing to bury that truth under layers of insulation and legal maneuvering. And if asbestos could be sold as a miracle while poisoning workers and families, what about the materials we still use today? Plastics, chemicals, everyday things. What if some of them are doing quiet damage? Not immediately visible, but deeply embedded in the systems that make us who we are. 34. Hormone disruptors in plastics affect human biology. Plastic was supposed to be the future. Light, durable, moldable. It made the modern world possible. Food packaging, water bottles, baby toys, medical devices. Plastic didn't just wrap our products, it wrapped around our lives. But hidden within that convenience was something else. Chemicals that don't stay put. Chemicals that leach into the things we eat, drink, and touch. Chemicals that change us from the inside out. They're called endocrine disruptors. The most infamous among them, BPA, bisphenol A, found in everything from water bottles to can linings to receipts. BPA mimics estrogen, a key human hormone. That may not sound like much, but hormones are delicate signals. They regulate everything from metabolism and mood to growth and reproduction. Even small disruptions can ripple into big consequences. As early as the 1990s, studies began showing that BPA and other similar compounds like phthalates were being absorbed into human bodies at measurable levels. Infants and children were particularly vulnerable. Some studies linked BPA exposure to developmental problems, behavioral disorders, early puberty, and fertility issues. In animals, the effects were even more dramatic. Feminized males, disrupted reproductive systems, and altered brain chemistry. The plastics industry responded predictably. They downplayed the risks, questioned the studies, and leaned hard on the old regulatory mantra, "The dose makes the poison." But endocrine disruptors don't play by that rule. Some have non-linear effects, meaning low doses may be more dangerous than high ones. Others build up over time. The science is complex. But the takeaway is simple. Exposure is widespread, and consequences are still being uncovered. In 2008, public pressure pushed major manufacturers to begin phasing out BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups. But the replacements? Often similar chemicals with even less testing. BPA-free became a marketing label, not a safety guarantee. The myth was that plastics are inert, just packaging, not chemistry. The truth is that some plastics are biologically active, even at invisible doses. And we've been living in a grand, uncontrolled experiment for decades. And if the chemical industry could blur the line between safe and unsafe for something as basic as food storage, what happens when the lie comes in the form of medicine? Prescribed by doctors, approved by regulators, and addictively profitable. 35. The opioid epidemic was fueled by Big Pharma. It started with a promise: pain relief without addiction. In the 1990s, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin, a powerful opioid marketed as a revolutionary painkiller. Its secret weapon was a time-release formula, supposedly making it less addictive. Sales reps were told to push it aggressively. Doctors were told addiction was rare. Patients were told their suffering had finally met its match, and they believed it, because the data was doctored. Purdue Pharma and other opioid manufacturers promoted the idea that pain was undertreated, and that opioids were the humane, modern solution. They cited misleading studies. One infamous letter to the editor in a medical journal, just 5 sentences long, was cited hundreds of times as evidence that opioids were safe. It wasn't a study, but it became scripture. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, internal memos painted a different picture. Purdue knew that OxyContin was being crushed, snorted, injected. They knew it was being overprescribed. They knew it was addictive. And they kept selling it. Doctors were incentivized. Pharmacies flooded. Pill mills sprouted up across the country, dispensing thousands of pills a day. In some towns, more opioids were prescribed than there were people. By the 2010s, the results were undeniable. Millions addicted, hundreds of thousands dead, communities hollowed out. The opioid crisis didn't emerge from street dealers. It started with lab coats, ad campaigns, and boardrooms. In 2007, Purdue pled guilty to misleading the public and paid over $600 million in fines. But the profits had already been made. Later lawsuits forced the company into bankruptcy. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue, faced public scrutiny, but retained much of their wealth. Settlements came with no admission of guilt, no real accountability. Other pharmaceutical companies followed similar paths. Johnson & Johnson, Teva, and others were implicated. Distributors like McKesson and AmerisourceBergen turned a blind eye to suspicious orders. It wasn't one bad actor. It was a system, built on denial, profit, and regulatory failure. The myth was that addiction came from weakness. The truth? It often came from a prescription pad. And if Big Pharma could lie that boldly about pain relief, what happens when local governments do the same? Not with pills, but with poisoned water. 36. The water in Flint, Michigan was poisoned. It was supposed to be a cost-saving measure. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan switched its water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River, a move intended to save money. Officials insisted the water was safe. Residents, however, quickly noticed otherwise. It smelled strange. It tasted foul. It came out discolored. People began getting rashes. Children began getting sick. And still the government said everything was fine. What they didn't say, at least not right away, was that the Flint River water was highly corrosive, and because the city failed to properly treat it, it began stripping lead from the city's aging pipes. That lead leached into the drinking water of thousands of homes. And lead, unlike bacteria or dirt, is invisible. You can't boil it away, you can't see it, but it can permanently damage a developing brain. Despite repeated warnings from scientists, doctors, and concerned residents, officials doubled down. They dismissed the complaints. They manipulated test data. They told whistleblowers to be quiet. It took more than a year, and the intervention of independent researchers, before the truth was undeniable. Flint's water was poisoned, and the government had known. Thousands of children were exposed. The long-term consequences may never be fully measured. And yet, accountability was slow, scattered, and largely symbolic. Some officials were charged. Most avoided jail. The deeper damage, trust, safety, health, was harder to repair. Flint wasn't just a crisis. It was a betrayal, and it revealed an ugly truth about how infrastructure, race, and poverty intersect. Would this have happened in a wealthy suburb? Would officials have ignored the cries of residents for over a year if they weren't mostly poor and black? The myth was that public water in America is always safe. The truth? It's only safe when the people in charge care enough to make it so. And while poisoned water might be invisible, so was another substance. One that literally glowed in the dark. One that made young women into human highlighters, all while being told it was perfectly safe. 37. Radium girls really died glowing. In the 1910s and 1920s, a new industry took off, literally glowing with promise. Radium, the mysterious element discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie, had entered the mainstream. It was marketed as a wonder substance, believed to boost energy, cure ailments, and, most notably, make watch dials glow in the dark. These luminous dials became essential for soldiers during World War I, who needed to read their watches at night without giving away their position. The job of painting these glowing numbers fell to young women. Hundreds of them, mostly in their teens and early 20s, were hired by companies like the United States Radium Corporation and Radium Dial. The work was considered clean, safe, even glamorous. The women were called shining girls, and they were taught a technique known as lip dip paint, where they shaped their brushes with their lips to get a fine point. Each dip of the brush meant a microscopic dose of radium into the body. With every shift, they were swallowing radioactivity. At the time, the dangers of radium were not entirely unknown, at least not to the people running the companies. Internal memos show executives knew radium was harmful and took precautions to protect male workers. The women, however, were not informed. In fact, they were told the substance was harmless, even healthy. Some workers painted their teeth and nails with the glowing substance for fun. Then the illnesses began. Teeth fell out, jaws crumbled, bones broke, tumors appeared. Doctors were baffled at first, until patterns emerged. These women weren't sick from chance. They were being poisoned from the inside. And yet, the companies denied responsibility. They accused the women of having syphilis, a smear that not only discredited them, but made it easier to ignore their suffering. Eventually, a group of 5 women took the company to court. They were dubbed the Radium Girls, and their case became one of the first major victories in workplace safety. Though many died before the case concluded, their persistence forced industry and government to confront the reality of occupational hazards. The myth was that these were isolated tragedies, a sad but unavoidable part of industrial progress. The truth? The companies knew. They lied. And they let young women rot from within to protect their profits. And while radium made women's bones glow, another darker truth was quietly emerging, that medical science itself had a long, repeated history of exploiting people, especially Black Americans, in the name of progress. 38. Doctors use Black patients for experiments without consent. The legacy of medical experimentation on Black Americans doesn't begin and end with Tuskegee. That's just the most well-known example. The truth is, for over a century, Black bodies were often used as raw material for American medicine, not as patients, but as test subjects, often without consent, often without even knowledge. In the 19th century, Dr. J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology, performed surgical experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. He justified it by claiming they couldn't feel pain the same way white women did, a myth rooted in racism, not biology. His work helped build the foundations of a medical specialty, Statues were erected in his honor. In the 20th century, the Tuskegee syphilis study kept 600 black men under observation for decades without treating them, just to see what would happen. But even beyond Tuskegee, exploitation persisted. Take the case of Henrietta Lacks. In 1951, Lacks, a black woman undergoing treatment for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins, had her cells taken without her knowledge. Those cells, known today as HeLa cells, became the first immortal cell line in medical history. They revolutionized science, used to develop the polio vaccine, cancer treatments, and gene mapping. Her cells went on to generate billions of dollars for research institutions and pharmaceutical companies. Her family for decades received nothing, not compensation, not even a thank you. In countless hospitals across the country, black patients were often subjected to experimental procedures, unapproved medications, and diagnostic trials, frequently without informed consent. Medical schools used black cadavers disproportionately. Some researchers assumed black bodies responded differently to pain or drugs, not based on science, but on bias. This wasn't just historical. Disparities in pain treatment, surgical outcomes, and diagnosis accuracy for black patients persist today, driven in part by generations of flawed and unethical research. The myth was that medical progress benefits everyone equally. The truth is that much of that progress was built on the backs, and often the bodies, of those who had no say. And if adults were exploited in silence, the next story takes that violation one step further. When entire generations of women were used as test subjects for a pill they didn't fully understand. 39. Early birth control trials were done on Puerto Rican women without full consent. In the 1950s, birth control was still controversial, legally restricted, morally debated, and largely unavailable to most women. But a group of researchers, including famed biologist Gregory Pincus and funded by eugenics enthusiast Margaret Sanger, wanted to change that. They believed the world was on the brink of overpopulation. They believed women needed control over reproduction. They also believed Puerto Rico was the perfect laboratory. At the time, Puerto Rico was grappling with poverty, unemployment, and rapid population growth. The U.S. government had already run sterilization campaigns on the island, often without full consent. So when American researchers arrived offering free contraceptive trials, many women signed up, some out of curiosity, some out of desperation, and many without being fully informed. The pills they were given were experimental. High doses of synthetic hormones. Side effects included nausea, blood clots, and severe pain. At least 3 women died during the trials, but no autopsies were conducted. Their deaths were dismissed. The priority was data, not safety. Many of the women didn't know they were part of a clinical trial. They believed they were receiving regular medical care. There were no standardized informed consent forms. Follow-up care was minimal. The trials did result in the approval of the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, in 1960. It changed reproductive freedom for millions of women around the world. But the women who bore the burden of that progress were left out of the story. Poor, brown, and disposable in the eyes of the institutions that used them. The myth was that birth control arrived through benevolent science. The truth? It was tested on vulnerable populations first, with minimal oversight and even less consent. And just when you think the line of ethical violations couldn't stretch further, it leads to yet another hidden chapter. One where American doctors crossed borders and crossed lines. 40. U.S. doctors infected people with STDs in Guatemala. It wasn't just unethical, it was international. Between 1946 and 1948, American doctors, backed by the U.S. Public Health Service, conducted a series of secret medical experiments in Guatemala. The goal? To test the effectiveness of penicillin against sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. But instead of waiting for volunteers or studying natural cases, they took a more hands-on approach. They deliberately infected people. Over 1,300 Guatemalans were exposed to STDs during the course of the study. The victims included prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and even children in orphanages. Many had no idea what was being done to them. They weren't told they were part of a study, they didn't give consent. Some were injected directly with bacteria. Others were offered sex with infected sex workers, arranged by the researchers themselves. Treatment was inconsistent. In some cases, it was withheld entirely just to observe the progression of disease. The study was led by Dr. John Cutler, who would later go on to work on the Tuskegee study. In internal reports, the language was clinical, methodical, almost detached, referring to subjects as data points rather than human beings. The research was never published. It remained hidden for decades. It wasn't until 2010, yes, 2010, that the full details came to light. A historian at Wellesley College stumbled upon archived documents that outlined the experiments. The reaction was swift and damning. Then President Barack Obama called the president of Guatemala to formally apologize. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued a public statement. A government commission was formed to investigate. What they found was horrifying. Not just the nature of the experiments, but the fact that they were approved at the highest levels of the U.S. health bureaucracy. The researchers knew what they were doing was wrong. They chose Guatemala because they couldn't get approval to do it in the U.S. The myth was that unethical medical experimentation was an ugly chapter limited to the mid-century American South. The truth? It was exported abroad, hidden away, and forgotten until someone found the receipts. And while these experiments were conducted quietly, in another part of the world, America's wars were getting louder and deadlier. Starting with a firestorm so intense, it made Hiroshima look like a footnote. 41. The U.S. firebombed Tokyo worse than Hiroshima. When people think of the horrors of World War II in Japan, they think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 atomic bombs, 2 cities flattened, tens of thousands killed instantly. The mushroom clouds are etched into public memory. But fewer people talk about March 9, 1945, the night Tokyo burned. It was called Operation Meeting House, and it was the most destructive bombing raid in history. That night, 334 B-29 bombers took off from U.S. bases and dropped nearly 1,700 tons of napalm-filled incendiary bombs on Tokyo, a city built largely of wood and paper. Within hours, 16 square miles were reduced to ash. Over 100,000 people died, most of them civilians. More than 1 million were left homeless. The firestorms were so intense that they sucked the air from underground shelters. Streets melted. Rivers boiled. Survivors described the city as a landscape of charred bodies and silence. But unlike the atomic bombings, the Tokyo firebombing was not debated or delayed. It wasn't presented to President Truman as a moral dilemma. It was strategy. Cold, deliberate strategy. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of the raid, later said, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." That wasn't an apology, it was an observation. The bombing campaign against Japan didn't stop there. Over the next 5 months, the U.S. firebombed over 60 Japanese cities. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final act. But by then, the stage had already been soaked in fire. The myth was that nuclear warfare was the singular atrocity of World War II. The truth? Conventional bombing did as much, if not more, damage. It just didn't come with the same moral branding. And if Tokyo could be reduced to ash without the world blinking, what else got buried? What about the crimes committed not from the air, but on the ground, by soldiers with orders and guns, and a government that tried to make it all disappear? 42. The My Lai massacre was covered up. It took place in a hamlet called My Lai in central Vietnam. March 16, 1968. A platoon of American soldiers entered the village searching for Viet Cong fighters. What they found instead were unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. What followed was not a firefight. It was an execution. Over the course of several hours, hundreds of civilians were killed. Witnesses described mass shootings, homes set on fire, even livestock slaughtered. There was no resistance. The soldiers weren't attacked. My Lai wasn't a battlefield. It was a massacre. The Army initially reported it as a victory. They called it an engagement with enemy forces, claiming high enemy casualties. Internally, however, some officers and soldiers were disturbed enough to report what they had seen. A young helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, intervened during the massacre and physically placed his crew between the soldiers and fleeing villagers. A rare act of courage in a moment of chaos, but when Thompson filed his report, it was buried. It wasn't until 1969, more than a year later, that journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. A former soldier, Ron Ridenour, had written letters to Congress, sparking a slow and reluctant investigation. Photos taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle surfaced. Undeniable evidence of what had happened. The public was shocked. The military scrambled. Eventually, a few officers were charged. Only one man, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He served just 3.5 years under house arrest. The cover-up was systematic. Reports were altered. Witnesses were intimidated. Commanders minimized their knowledge. And the Pentagon only acted when the story became too large to contain. The myth was that American soldiers always fought with honor. The truth is that in war, especially a war as murky and mismanaged as Vietnam, the lines blur, and sometimes they vanish entirely. And if one atrocity could be covered up for over a year, what about the others? What about the ones that happened when no cameras were around and no whistleblowers came forward? What about the wars that were never even declared? 43. U.S. soldiers committed atrocities in Iraq. The Iraq War was sold as liberation. Democracy would bloom in the desert, and America would be the gardener. But beneath the rhetoric, inside military bases and prison cells, something far uglier took root. Not a story of heroes, but of dehumanization, humiliation, and official silence. By the early 2000s, reports began to surface of abuse by U.S. personnel, not on the battlefield, but in detention centers. The most infamous was Abu Ghraib, a prison near Baghdad where Iraqis were held, many without formal charges. In 2004, photographs leaked to the press showed detainees stripped, hooded, chained, and forced into degrading positions. American soldiers stood nearby, smiling, giving thumbs up. The images were undeniable. But the context was even worse. The soldiers weren't rogue actors acting in isolation. They were following a system, one that had blurred the line between interrogation and abuse. The orders weren't always explicit, but the culture was permissive. The chain of command emphasized extracting information, breaking morale, and projecting dominance. In some cases, civilians, including contractors working for private military firms, participated in or encouraged the abuse. Oversight was minimal. Accountability was delayed. And the fallout? Slow and strategically managed. The Bush administration condemned the actions but framed them as isolated incidents. A few low-ranking soldiers were prosecuted, but higher-ups avoided real consequences. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld remained in office. The architects of the war continued their work. The system, bruised but unbroken, carried on. Beyond Abu Ghraib, other atrocities were reported. Civilian casualties from airstrikes, families killed at checkpoints, mass detentions, allegations of torture in black sites. For years, such accounts were dismissed as anti-American propaganda, until internal military logs and whistleblower leaks, like the Iraq war logs published by WikiLeaks, confirmed the scale of the violence and the pattern of cover-ups. The myth was that American intervention, while messy, was fundamentally noble. The truth? It was built on shaky intelligence, maintained by silence, and marred by war crimes committed in the shadows. And if atrocities could be normalized overseas, what does that say about America's earliest battles? The ones fought before the modern military, before the cameras, when blankets were weapons and diplomacy was soaked in sickness. 4P4. The U.S. gave smallpox blankets to Native Americans. It's the kind of story you're told can't be true. Too brutal, too colonial, too much like something out of a villain's monologue in a movie. But history, again, doesn't flinch. In 1763, during Pontiac's Rebellion, a native uprising against British military occupation in the Great Lakes region, the British commander at Fort Pitt came up with a strategy to suppress resistance. He ordered that smallpox-infected blankets from the fort's hospital be given to local Native American tribes as a gift, a kind of twisted diplomacy. The plan was recorded in a letter from British officer Colonel Henry Bouquet to General Jeffrey Amherst. Amherst replied with chilling efficiency, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians." Bouquet responded that he would attempt to spread smallpox via blankets or other methods that may serve to extirpate this execrable race. These were British officers, not American. But they were acting in the territory that would soon become the United States, and the tactics, attitudes, and strategies they employed would echo through centuries of American policy toward indigenous peoples: displacement, containment, extermination. Not as metaphor, but as military and bureaucratic goals. While there is only one well-documented case of this particular form of biological warfare, at Fort Pitt, it casts a long shadow. Some historians debate how effective the infected blankets were in spreading disease. But the intent? That part is crystal clear, and the implications run deeper than one fort, one act. Smallpox decimated native populations throughout the Americas, often unintentionally, but sometimes not. The idea that colonial powers could use disease as a weapon wasn't fringe. It was discussed, documented, even encouraged in correspondence between leaders. The myth was that genocide is always blunt. Guns, violence, battles. The truth? Sometimes it comes folded in cloth, handed over with a smile, and written into letters historians would one day unearth. And if biological weapons were used before America was even a country, what happened once the military-industrial complex was fully formed, and soldiers became test subjects for chemicals their own government wouldn't admit to using? 45 U.S. troops conducted chemical weapons tests on their own people. It was called Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. It sounds like a program designed to protect soldiers, and that was the official line. But the reality was far murkier. Between the 1960s and 1970s, under the broader umbrella of Project 112, the Department of Defense conducted a series of chemical and biological warfare tests on U.S. military personnel, often without their knowledge. Thousands of sailors aboard Navy ships were exposed to nerve agents, biological simulants, and chemical compounds. The purpose? To test how these agents would disperse in various environments and how effective existing protective measures were in real-world conditions. But the participants were rarely informed. They weren't told what substances they were exposed to. They weren't given informed consent. They weren't even debriefed after the tests concluded. Many veterans later reported health problems, respiratory issues, neurological symptoms, and cancers, without knowing what they had been exposed to. The government denied the program's existence for decades. Requests for medical records were met with silence or redacted pages. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that the Department of Defense finally acknowledged the tests, under pressure from veterans groups, journalists, and Congress. Even then, the admission came wrapped in caveats. The substances used were mostly harmless, officials said. The exposure levels were minimal. But independent studies raised doubts. Some of the simulants used, like zinc-cadmium sulfide, were linked to long-term health risks. Others, like Siren and VX, were lethal in even tiny doses. The myth was that U.S. troops are always protected by the institutions they serve. The truth? Sometimes they're used as lab rats in experiments they never agreed to, and then left to deal with the consequences alone. And if soldiers can be quietly exposed to chemicals, what about the rest of the country? What happens when corruption poisons not just the air, but the economy? When the bombs aren't real, but the crash is? When lies are printed not in memos but in financial statements? 46. The 2008 financial crash was caused by fraud. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some mysterious economic force no one could have predicted. The 2008 financial crisis was the result of deliberate decisions, a chain of lies, risks, and short-term greed dressed up as strategy. Fraud, in the plainest possible terms, built a house of cards and sold it to the world. At the center of it all were subprime mortgages, high-interest home loans given to borrowers with poor credit, low income, or both. In a rational market, these would have been small, risky bets. But in the early 2000s, banks discovered they could bundle these shaky loans together into financial products called mortgage-backed securities, MBS. These were then sliced into tranches, rated by credit agencies, and sold to investors as high-grade, low-risk investments. The ratings were false, the risks were hidden, and everyone at the top knew. Major financial institutions, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG, Countrywide, and others, were creating and selling toxic assets while betting against them in private. They called it innovation. It was closer to arson. Some banks made loans they knew borrowers couldn't repay, only to pass the risk on to someone else. Mortgage brokers falsified documents. Credit rating agencies, paid by the very banks they rated, slapped AAA labels on junk. By 2007, the warning signs were everywhere. Rising defaults, falling home values, and a bloated financial system with no real footing. But the money was still flowing, and no one wanted to be the first to blink. Then it collapsed. Lehman Brothers went under. AIG had to be rescued. The housing market cratered. Retirement accounts vanished. Jobs disappeared. Over 10 million Americans lost their homes. Global markets plunged. The world watched Wall Street melt down in real time. Not from overregulation or socialist meddling, but from unchecked fraud at the highest levels. The aftermath? Congress rushed to stabilize the system with a $700 billion bailout. Executives received golden parachutes. No major banking CEOs went to prison. A few were fined, often far less than they made. The institutions were too big to fail. The victims were not. The myth was that the crash was unforeseeable, the result of bad luck and complex markets. The truth? It was foreseeable, preventable, and orchestrated by people who got richer as everyone else fell. And while Wall Street was rescued with taxpayer money, Main Street? It got foreclosures, pink slips, and silence. 47. Wall Street was bailed out. Main Street wasn't. When the financial crisis hit its peak in late 2008, the government moved fast. Banks were teetering. Credit had frozen. Confidence was evaporating. So Congress, with pressure from both the Bush and Obama administrations, stepped in with an unprecedented lifeline, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Hundreds of billions were injected into the financial system. The message was clear. If the banks failed, so would the country. The bailout was framed as necessary. Emergency surgery, a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. And for the big banks, it worked. They stabilized, they merged, they recovered. Within a few years, bonuses were back. Stock prices rebounded. The people who helped cause the crisis? They mostly walked away richer. But regular Americans didn't get a bailout. They got evicted. While TARP propped up financial institutions, homeowner relief was slow, inconsistent, and riddled with red tape. Programs like HAMP, Home Affordable Modification Program, were underfunded and poorly managed. Banks, now flush with government cash, foreclosed on millions of homeowners anyway. In many cases, they used forged documents, a practice known as robo-signing. The legal fallout was minimal. Small businesses shuttered. State and local governments laid off workers. People who had spent decades building modest lives lost everything: their savings, their equity, their sense of security. Meanwhile, Wall Street returned to record profits. The moral contradiction was hard to miss. The people who inflated the bubble were rescued by the people crushed when it popped. The idea that the market was free fell apart the moment it threatened the powerful. For everyone else, the invisible hand became a closed fist. Politicians offered thoughts in hearings. Some gave speeches about accountability. But structural change? Minimal. Financial reform laws like Dodd-Frank were passed, but regulators were outgunned. The system adjusted. The bonuses returned. The gap widened. The myth was that we all suffered equally. The truth? The wealthiest were shielded by the very institutions they broke. The rest were told to tighten their belts and wait for the recovery. And beneath that economic silence, another truth was buried, one that affected millions long before the crisis and continues today, because while the cost of living rose, wages didn't. Not by accident, but by design. 48. Minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation for decades. The federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 an hour. That number hasn't changed since 2009, but the prices around it have. Rent, groceries, gas, medical bills, everything has gone up, except the minimum needed to survive. Adjusted for inflation, today's minimum wage has less buying power than it did in the 1960s. Back then, a minimum wage worker could afford a modest apartment, groceries, and maybe even put a little aside. Today, that same worker, working full-time, would still fall below the poverty line in many states. Forget savings, forget healthcare, forget upward mobility. For decades, economists and labor advocates have pointed out the disconnect. When worker productivity rises, wages should rise too. But in the U.S., they haven't kept pace. Since the 1970s, productivity has increased dramatically. While real wages have stagnated, the difference didn't disappear. It went to profits, to shareholders, to executive bonuses. Opponents of raising the minimum wage argue that it kills jobs or raises prices. But studies in cities and states that have increased wages show mixed results, and often job loss doesn't occur at the levels predicted. What does increase? Worker stability, lower turnover, modest economic growth at the local level. Meanwhile, corporate profits hit record highs. Companies buy back their own stock. CEOs earn hundreds of times what their average employees make, and millions of workers, many of whom kept the country running through recessions and pandemics, live paycheck to paycheck. The myth is that low-wage workers just need to work harder, climb the ladder, and prove themselves. The truth? The ladder's been shortened, and the rungs were sold for scrap. And the rules that govern this system? Many of them weren't written by legislators. Not really. They were handed to them by the people with the money to shape the law itself. 49. Corporations write much of U.S. legislation. In theory, lawmakers write laws. In practice, they often just sign off on documents handed to them by corporate lobbyists. Over the past several decades, the U.S. legislative process has become increasingly entangled with corporate interests. It's not a conspiracy in the shadows. It's an open secret on Capitol Hill. Major companies and industry groups regularly draft entire bills, submit them to friendly legislators, and watch as their proposed laws move through Congress with little to no alteration. One of the clearest examples of this is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Founded in the 1970s, ALEC brings together corporate representatives and state lawmakers to craft model legislation. In other words, corporations sit down with politicians and co-author bills that serve their mutual interests. These templates are then introduced in state legislatures across the country, often word for word. From voter ID laws to tax cuts to environmental deregulation, ALEC has left fingerprints on policy nationwide. This isn't limited to ALEC. Almost every major industry, big pharma, big oil, tech, telecom, agriculture, has lobbyists stationed in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. They spend millions crafting bills, influencing language, and ensuring loopholes. Sometimes these bills are hundreds of pages long. Lawmakers, pressed for time and short on staff, may not even read them in full. That's not hyperbole. It's how the system now functions. The 2008 financial crisis, for example, was followed by Dodd-Frank, a sweeping reform bill aimed at regulating Wall Street. but many of its most powerful rules were watered down before passage, thanks to intense lobbying by the very banks it was meant to regulate. Over time, through lobbying and legal challenges, even more of those rules were rolled back. The Affordable Care Act faced similar pressures. Pharmaceutical and insurance companies negotiated behind closed doors to ensure certain provisions, like the ban on drug price negotiation, stayed out of the final bill. And when corporate interests can't write the bills themselves, they still fund the think tanks that produce the white papers. They sponsor the studies. They host the retreats. They bankroll the campaigns. The return on investment is staggering. A single lobbying dollar can yield hundreds in tax breaks, subsidies, or favorable regulations. The myth is that American democracy is driven by voters and elected representatives. The truth? Much of the legislation shaping your life was first drafted by someone in a tailored suit with a corporate badge, in a hotel conference room, at a policy retreat you weren't invited to. And so, we close the list where we began, not with mystery, but with quiet certainty. The truth was never hiding. It was just inconvenient, too complex, too profitable to question. These weren't the fever dreams of conspiracy theorists. They were documented, archived, confirmed, and largely ignored. Because in the end, the most dangerous myths are the ones that look like common sense. That power is earned, that justice is blind, that history is neutral. They never were. And maybe, deep down, we always knew.